I will turn the microphone over to John and Stephen. I think John is going first. So, John, welcome, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks, Andrew, and good morning to everybody, or at least good morning where I am, whatever time of the day it may be, wherever you guys are. It's great to see such a broad range of participants in the session this morning, where we will discuss, as Andrew said, what is a very important element of the Amount A framework, and that's the one that relates to the elimination of double taxation. Okay, so the background to the elimination of double taxation. And as I said a moment ago, it's a key Amount A building block. It's clearly a very important aspect of the Amount A framework. Why is that? Well, that's for several reasons. First of all, it's all about reconciling the Amount A framework with the existing approach to the taxation of profits, the existing international tax framework. And it's all about trying to make those two things to work together to make sure that profits are only taxed once. So we're all about avoiding double taxation and ensuring that the two regimes come together nicely and we're not left with inappropriate outcomes. Now, that of course means that this is quite a sensitive and therefore challenging issue, because in turn it determines which jurisdictions will be giving up taxation of existing profits to eliminate double taxation of profits under the Amount A framework. And perhaps as we go through the slides, you will see why that was so challenging and why the delicate agreement that has been reached by the TFD and the inclusive framework looks perhaps as it does. So if we turn our minds back to what the October statement said on the elimination of double taxation, it said two things. First of all, it said that the double taxation of profit allocated to market jurisdictions will be relieved using either the exemption or the credit method. Now, of course, both of those methods will be familiar to many of you, most of you, all of you, perhaps. And all that says, therefore, in the October statement is that jurisdictions will have a choice about how they give effect to the elimination of double taxation. The second thing that the October said was that the entity or entities that will bear the tax liability will be drawn from those that earn residual profit. So again, the October statement gave us a general principle for how we might go about eliminating double taxation. But it did no more. And therefore, the Task Force for the Digital Economy had to go about its work from October onwards to make use of that general principle, to put some meat on the bones for what that general principle we were given in the October statement gave us. So what did that process give us? Where did we get to? Well, we have the rules for the elimination of double taxation contained in Title V of the model rules that were included within the July progress report. And those rules apply according to two guiding principles. First, the process to eliminate double taxation applies on a quantitative basis. And second, they apply on a jurisdictional basis. Now, we'll come on to think about what those two things mean in practice as we go through the slides, but it's worth having at the back of your mind that those guiding rules, those guiding principles to how we go about the elimination of double taxation have at their forefront the need for simplicity as far as it is possible, administrability, and the avoidance of distortions. So how do we prevent the rules from producing inappropriate outcomes? There is perhaps an additional, more practical concern that sits behind the rules as they stand, which is also the equitable application of the rules. So how do we eliminate double taxation in a way that is fair between those jurisdictions that will be called upon to eliminate double taxation of profits arising under amount A. Now, this process then breaks down into two sub-issues. The first is identification. So, how do we identify the jurisdictions that will be required to eliminate double taxation? How do we decide where the responsibility for eliminating double taxation arises? The second is allocation. So once we have identified those jurisdictions that may be responsible for eliminating double taxation, for relieving double taxation, how much double taxation is each of those jurisdictions that have been identified required to relieve? And again, here we're just an introduction, but this is the general approach that was taken in the rules that we'll go through in a little more detail as we work through these slides. As I mentioned, the rules are found in Title 5 of the July Progress Report, but Title 5 in turn relies upon a number of definitions and rules which are found in Schedules I and J. And Stephen, my colleague, will speak about those two schedules in a short while. Okay, so we will start with the first of the two steps that I described a moment ago, and that is identification. So how do the rules go about identifying the jurisdictions that may be required to relieve double taxation? And in turn, you'll see on the slide that there are two elements to identification. The first is a de minimis profit rule, and the idea here is that jurisdictions with de minimis profits are excluded from the elimination process up front. So before we undertake any of our detailed calculations, the rules seek to identify the jurisdictions with a low level of profit and takes them out of scope of the elimination process. The second step looks at the profitability of jurisdictions. Those jurisdictions with higher levels of profitability will be required to eliminate double taxation first, and we will see how that process works in a moment. But the important thing to note is that the calculation of profitability within a jurisdiction is calculated by the return on depreciation and payroll on a jurisdictional basis. So the key calculation here is the return on depreciation on payroll, and that applies on a relative basis. So the return on depreciation and payroll in a jurisdiction is compared with the group's worldwide return on depreciation and payroll figure. So those are the two key elements when we think about identification. And we'll start by thinking about the de minimis profit rules. So jurisdictions with de minimis profits are excluded from the pool of potential relieving jurisdictions. So if there is a low level of profit within a jurisdiction, then the TFD decided that it's only right that those jurisdictions are not called upon to relieve double taxation. And this rule applies up front. So there is also an administrative, a simplicity, a tax certainty angle to this rule, because first of all, it limits the number of jurisdictions that might be called upon to eliminate double taxation, therefore reducing the number of interactions that the M&E group and tax administrations have to think about. But it also it streamlines the rules for exactly those reasons too. So the benefits of having a de minimis profit rule are several, and the question becomes, well, how does that rule apply? And what do de minimis profits look like in the context of the amount A framework? This next slide sets out how that rule applies. And there are two legs to this test. And it says that the jurisdictions potentially required to eliminate double taxation, jurisdictions referred to as specified jurisdictions within the rule, are, first of all, those jurisdictions that are part of the smallest group of jurisdictions with respect to which the aggregate elimination profit, and we'll talk about elimination profit a little bit later on, but for the time being, just think about profit of the group. That's the easiest way to think about it as we conceptualize the de minimis rule, that totals at least 95% of the group's total elimination profit, giving priority to jurisdictions with higher elimination profit. Now, I'm sure that many of you, when first reading that test, are perhaps scratching your head a little bit. And part of the reason for that is that describing that rule accurately is kind of tricky. But actually, when you think about how the rule applies in practice, it's relatively straightforward. So in practice, a group will be required to rank jurisdictions by elimination profit from high to low. So number one, jurisdiction with the highest elimination profit. How much is that elimination profit? It might be 100. Second highest jurisdiction is 80, and so on and so on and so on. And you would add together the elimination profit of each of those jurisdictions until you reach at least 95% of the group's total elimination profit. Let's say that that gives you 5 jurisdictions, but there are maybe 10 jurisdictions that the group operates in total. So the first 5 jurisdictions would potentially be called upon to eliminate. The remaining 5 under this leg of the rule would fall outside of the jurisdictions potentially required to eliminate double taxation. And so the de minimis profit rule may mean that those jurisdictions aren't required to eliminate double taxation. The second leg of the test says that notwithstanding the jurisdictions identified under the first leg of the test, each jurisdiction with elimination profit of at least 50 million euros does fall within that pool of jurisdictions that might be required to eliminate. So what the rule does is give us in the first leg a relative test. So we look at the role that a jurisdiction plays in the overall framework, in the overall, when we think about the profitability of the group as a whole. And then the second test is an absolute test, which just looks at the amount of profit that a covered group makes in a particular jurisdiction. So the next part of our approach, and once we've applied the de minimis rule and identified the jurisdictions that might be required to eliminate double taxation, the second part of the approach to identification of those jurisdictions is to determine, okay, well, now we have this group of jurisdictions, how do we think about profitability? Because those with them that are the most profitable are required to eliminate double taxation. And as I mentioned before, return on depreciation and payroll is used to determine profitability. Stephen will talk about the definition of depreciation and payroll in a moment. But ultimately, depreciation and payroll expenses are the principal labor and capital costs incurred by a business. And so there is a rationale there for determining profitability on the basis of these costs. And the test operates, as I mentioned, right at the very beginning on a jurisdictional basis. And it does so to avoid some distortions that might arise if the test were applied on an entity basis. So, turning to the second of our overarching principles, and that's allocation. So, following the steps that I just described, we've identified the jurisdictions that might be required to relieve double taxation. And now that we have our candidates, how do we go about allocating the responsibility or the obligation to relieve double taxation to each of those candidates that have made our shortlist? And we do so following the tier framework. So relieving jurisdictions are placed into a tier based on the multinational enterprise's profitability, which again is based on return on depreciation and payroll. So we look at the overall group's return on depreciation and payroll, and then we compare the return on depreciation and payroll in each jurisdiction to determine which tier a relieving jurisdiction is placed into. And perhaps an aside here, but we use that relative test, so the one that compares a jurisdiction's return to the group's overall return, to make sure that the rules deal with different business models, because, of course, for example, a group whose business is heavily reliant upon tangible assets may have a lower return on depreciation and payroll than a group that does not. So maybe a digital business that has fewer tangible assets. So the relative approach, looking at the group's overall RODP figure, seeks to cater for different business models. And the general rule of thumb is that the general principle is that double taxation is first relieved by the jurisdictions in which the multinational enterprise has the highest profitability. The tiering approach, as we will see in a moment, applies just as you would expect. So you have tier 1, you have tier 2, 3A and 3B, and jurisdictions in tier 1 provide relief from double taxation first, jurisdictions in tier 2 second, and so on and so forth. But the important thing to note is that the jurisdictions in lower tiers are only required to relieve double taxation in circumstances where relief in the higher tiers is insufficient. The second thing to note is that there are different approaches to the allocation of the obligation to eliminate double taxation according to which tier a jurisdiction falls within. So in tier 1, we use what is called the waterfall approach, and in tiers 2, 3A and 3B, we use the pro rata approach. Now, don't worry, in the coming slides, we will unpack a little bit what all of this means in a bit more detail. And in seeking to unpack that in a bit more detail for you, we have here another slide which effectively reflects what was on the prior slide, but with a bit more colour and a diagram, which hopefully makes things a little bit clearer to you. So tier 1 is the highest tier, and a jurisdiction falls within tier 1 if the return on depreciation and payroll in that jurisdiction is more than 15 times the group return on depreciation and payroll. So 1,500% of the group return on depreciation and payroll. Jurisdictions in tier 1 relieve on a waterfall basis, and we'll discuss that in a moment. And relief will be provided within tier 1s exclusively if there are sufficient profits within arising in jurisdictions that fall in tier 1 to provide complete relief from double taxation. However, if there are not enough tier 1 profits to provide complete relief from double taxation, then we move into tier 2. And tier 2 profits are those between 150%, so 1.5 times the group return on depreciation and payroll, up to the ceiling of 15 times group RODP, which of course you'll recall is tier 1. A jurisdiction can be, and likely will be, in tier 1 and in tier 2. So just because a jurisdiction has been called upon to relieve double taxation in tier 1 does not excuse it from being within tier 2. It's just the level of profits above that threshold of 15 times group RODP that are relieved in tier 1. But that doesn't mean that a jurisdiction doesn't then fall and is required to relieve double taxation under tier 2. If the profits in tier 2 are not sufficient to relieve double taxation, then we move to tier 3A. If the profits in 3A are not sufficient, we move to 3B. But there is a flaw in tier 3B, and that's because a jurisdiction will not be required to eliminate double taxation if its return on depreciation and payroll is equivalent to 10% return on revenue. And you'll remember that the October progress report, the October statement, says that residual profits are those above a 10% return on revenue. So the rules make sure that where profits do not exceed that amount, then a jurisdiction will not be required to eliminate double taxation, such that the RODP equivalent of a 10% return on revenue is reduced. Okay, So tier one applies following a so-called waterfall approach. And before I speak about the rationale, I'll perhaps turn this slide on its head and talk about how the waterfall approach works. So again, we rank jurisdictions with a return greater than 15 times group RODP based on their RODP from high to low. The most profitable jurisdiction by that measure is required to eliminate double taxation first until its own RODP is equal with the jurisdiction that has the second most profitable RODP, the second most measure of profitability. These two jurisdictions then relieve double taxation until their RODP is equal with the jurisdiction with the third highest RODP, and so on, until the RODP of those jurisdictions is reduced to 1,500% of group RODP. That is the floor of tier one. Now, returning to the top of this slide, what's the rationale for that approach? Well, the first reason for following this approach is that it's equitable, because relieving jurisdictions will never end up with returns lower than other jurisdictions in tier one, because the approach reduces their RODP until it reaches the next highest, and so on and so on. So it reduces them, and such that in a way that means their return on depreciation and payroll is equal with those other jurisdictions in tier one, until we either completely eliminate double taxation or we reach the floor in tier one. This also means that the jurisdictions required to eliminate double taxation first are those with the highest returns. And that recognizes that the existing rules sometimes create inappropriate results. And of course, that is the whole rationale, or one of the rationales for Amount A in the first place, that the existing rules don't always allocate the taxation of profits to the appropriate places. So the waterfall approach seeks to ensure that large outliers, those with considerable residual profits, are required to eliminate double taxation first, to ensure that profits are better allocated to the places where they might be considered to be properly taxed. Next, we think about tiers 2, 3A and 3B. And to begin with, we'll just think about the approach to allocating double tax, the obligation to relieve double taxation within those tiers. And as the name suggests, instead of following a water approach, we follow a pro rata approach that seeks to allocate the obligation to eliminate double taxation equally between all jurisdictions that fall within a particular tier. So, for example, those jurisdictions that fall within tier 2, that have tier 2 profits within those two ranges that we saw on a previous slide, will be allocated the obligation to eliminate double taxation in proportion to their share of the profitability of profits within a particular group. So, turning to tier 2, well, first of all, we identify the tier 2 jurisdictions. So those are the jurisdictions that have returns greater than 150% of group RODP. Once we've identified those jurisdictions and we know the profits that arise in each of those jurisdictions, we allocate the obligation to eliminate double taxation between those jurisdictions. And that applies until either we have fully allocated the obligation to eliminate double taxation, so all those profits of which we need to eliminate double taxation, or the profits within tier 2 are exhausted. And if they are exhausted, we then move to tier 3A. As I mentioned a moment ago, the tier 1 jurisdictions will also be required to relieve double taxation in tier 2, but only in respect of the profits that haven't been used to eliminate double taxation in tier 1. So a tier 1 jurisdiction will also be in tier 2, but they will not be required to eliminate double taxation on the same profits against which they have provided double taxation relief in tier 1. Okay, and next we move to tiers 3A and 3B. And you'll recall that we have different thresholds here from the previous slide. So tier 3 jurisdictions in the whole are those that have a return on depreciation and payroll equivalent to 10% return on revenue for a given group. So a return beyond that figure, in excess of that figure. And just an aside here, a kind of practical aside, to find the 10% ROR equivalent is just a case of multiplying the group revenue by 10% and dividing by its depreciation and payroll. Now, jurisdictions in tier 3 are split into 2 groups. Those with an absolute return on depreciation and payroll of less than 40% are in tier 3B. Those with an RODP above that absolute figure are in tier 3A. Jurisdictions in tier 3A are obliged to eliminate double taxation ahead of those in tier 3B. But if tier 3A profits are not sufficient to eliminate double taxation, then we move down into 3B. But as I mentioned before, there is that floor of a 10% return on revenue equivalent to make sure that we are only providing relief against residual profits as they were defined in the October statement. Okay, at this stage, I think we'll move on to those schedules that I mentioned earlier, which provide us with some of those definitions. And at this stage, I'll hand over to Steve to walk you through those definitions.